Hi, folks. We are going to try to get through 3 chapters in this video, chapters 14, 15, and 16. Since we're nearing the end of the book, some events are picking up the pace, so we're going to try to get this done too. When we last saw John, he and Lenina had been having an altercation at the end of chapter 13. Lenina was trying to make some moves on John. He does not. He has a really negative response to her trying to kiss him. He gets violent with her. And what we didn't really address in the last video, because we ran short on time, was the fact that Lenina kind of runs into another room, locks herself in this other room because she's scared, and John receives a phone call. So this phone call that he received at the end of chapter 13 was to alert him that something was happening with Linda, his mother. Remember, Linda's been in this soma-induced stupor, and we were warned that with the amount of soma that she was taking, she was probably not going to survive more than 1 or 2 more months, because the amount of soma she'd be taking would be shutting down her respiratory system, paralyzing her respiratory system, so she'd essentially suffocate. So John gets this call that something's happening with Linda, and he immediately rushes out, and that's where we pick up with chapter 14. We find ourselves at the Park Lane Hospital for the Dying, which, again, we see as a building in London. We get a sense that it's a 60-story tower. And so this hospital for the dying is kind of like a nursing home. It's the last place you go before you die in the world state. So John is called to this area, or to this building, to see what's going on with his mother. And so he finds he goes in, he finds a nurse. He's all in a hurry because we have to put ourselves in John's shoes. If he's getting news that his mother is dying, he's going to be really emotionally invested in being there. He's going to be experiencing quite a loss. But we see a difference in perspective through the eyes of the nurse who's working there. She's really shocked because she's noticing that he's in this huge hurry, and he asks if there's any hope, and she asks, what, that she's not going to die? No, if she's here, she's going to die. And so she takes John to go to Linda's bedside, and we see Linda lying in a row of beds in this hospital wing, and she's kind of dozing in and out. She's not very coherent at this time. So John goes to Linda. He's holding onto her hand, because this is a really tough moment for him. His mom's dying. And so the nurse seems to think that he's settled in. She's really kind of on edge about him to begin with. And he starts singing her those little rhymes that she sang to him: ABC and vitamin D, the fats in the liver and the cods in the sea. So he starts singing these childish songs to her that he remembered her singing to him when he was a child. And so we get this moment where we see again some this sense of humanity that we don't necessarily experience in the world state. And he's really, really moved by this moment. But the nurse had left because she had a whole bunch of children coming into this wing of the hospital, and we see these children kind of swarming. They're all from one Bakanovsky group. this stream of identical 8-year-old male twins, twin after twin after twin. They came a nightmare. Their faces, their repeated face, for there's only one between the lot of them, puggishly stared, all nostrils and pale, googling eyes. Their uniform was khaki. So we see this horde of Delta, a Bakanovskified group of Deltas. And this is John's true first encounter with a Bakanovsky group. He's never seen so many identical people before, and so he's really taken aback. And these kids are swarming all over, crawling on top of beds, looking at the other patients who are lying in their beds, and kind of acting like they've gone to the zoo. And we find out, because John's really taken aback, why are these filthy brats here? He asks. He says, this is disgraceful that these children are running around. And the nurse's response is, disgraceful? But what do you mean? They're being death conditioned. So we find out that these children are being taught from an early age, like, what death looks like. And they start to associate death with, like, this kind of peaceful place, and they don't have any emotional connections to the people who they are witnessing in this hospital. And so the nurse even warns John, like, you better not interfere with their conditioning. I'll kick you out if you do. So he's sitting there with Linda, and Linda doesn't really recognize John when she does come to. She thinks that he is Pope. She calls out for Pope. John gets really upset that he's not recognizable to her. And finally, like, as she kind of comes to again, he's been shouting John at her, and she kind of has this moment of realization that this is her son. And what ends up happening is we see this moment where Linda starts grasping at her neck, and she's gasping for air. And we know as readers what's happening, because we were warned about what would happen to her based on her soma use. Her respiratory system is being paralyzed, and John has no idea what's really going on, though. So he's crying out. He thinks he's killed her, but he watches his mother die in front of him, and this is really traumatic for him. He runs out to get the nurse, who's kind of corralling this horde of Bakanovsky twins. The nurse has to decide what she's going to do, if it's going to be something where she's going to have to kick John out. She tries to distract the kids with treats, with chocolate eclairs, and John is just overcome. He keeps repeating, oh God, oh God, oh God. And as he runs back towards Linda's room, he has little children, like these little boys. A few of them follow him, and they ask, is she dead? And then John doesn't even know how to respond to that kind of a question. So he just shoves this kid to the floor, and the little kid starts crying, which brings us to chapter 15 in the immediate aftermath of Linda's death. So John is storming out of the Park Lane Hospital for Dying, and it's towards the end of the workday at about 5 p.m. And so these two Bakanovsky groups of adult deltas, a group of women and a group of men, are lining up at the end of the day to get paid. And we find out that these deltas are not being paid monetary compensation. They're actually getting paid in a ration of soma for their work at the end of the day. So John pushes through this this group as they're waiting for their soma, and he realizes what this is. He notices that they're waiting in line, they're getting soma, and he's just seen what soma use has done to his mother, and so he starts kind of rebelling against it. He kind of causes this whole riot. He's yelling out, "Oh, brave new world, oh, brave new world," quoting Shakespeare over and over again. He's shoving, he makes this proclamation, he yells to get these people's attention. And so he calls stop. The deputy sub-bursar, who's paying people in soma, recognizes him, acknowledges it's the savage, and has this moment of fear. And John, who now is no longer called John, there's been this shift. He's called the Savage. And so we want to pay attention to if he's referred to by his name from here on out, because by not referring to him by his name, it's in essence dehumanizing him and putting him in this position of being no more than an animal or a savage. So, he yells out, "Don't take this stuff, that horrible stuff. It's poison. It's poison." He's knocking soma out of people's hands. And meanwhile, while he's having this fit and causing this riot, Bernard and Helmholtz are looking for him, and he's not in his rooms, but a telephone rings as Bernard and Helmholtz are looking for John, that is telling them that the savage has been causing this riot. So it's up to Helmholtz and Bernard to go calm things down in this mob. So they get to the mob, and we find out that they've used soma vapor, essentially like tear gas, to calm down this riot. There's a bit of a resort to some like riot control, but instead of escalating the violence, we see them quote the language used when they're playing this track to control the riot is "my friends, my friends." Why aren't you being what is the meaning of this? Why aren't you happy? And so we get some soma vapor tossed in that helps calm everything down right away. The deltas end up getting a new dosage of soma, but Bernard, Helmholtz, and John are carted off by police, and they are going to be escorted to go deal with the higher ups. Remember, Mustafa Mond, the world controller, had given Bernard permission to bring John here. And in a very short amount of time, a lot of chaos is created in John's wake. So that brings us to chapter 16, where we are now in the controller's study. And in that study, we have Helmholtz, Bernard, and John waiting for Mustafa Mond to appear to deal with them. So when Mustafa Mond comes in, he asks, "So you don't much like civilization, Mr. Savage?" And John, looking at him, decides to tell the truth and says, "No." John's sense of civilization is much different than what Mustafa Mond imagines civilization should be. And we see this kind of conflict at its core that arises. So Mustafa Mond has this conversation with Bernard and Helmholtz and John, or Mr. Savage, as Mustafa Mond calls him, about philosophically what the differences are between the civilization of the world state and the world that John has come from. So Mustafa Mond and John have a moment of connection, though. We find out that Mustafa Mond has an understanding of civilization from before. And we saw that in chapter 3. But Mustafa Mond and John asked Mustafa Mond, why don't you let them see in Othello? Why do they not know this information? And so he asks, why don't you let them see Othello? And Mustafa Mond's response is, well, it's old. They don't know about it because we've gotten rid of it. And John remembers that they had that Helmholtz had laughed at Romeo and Juliet. And he says, but even though it's old, we still understand it. And why can't they rewrite something like Othello, but that's new? And Helmholtz says, that's what we've been wanting to write. And the world controller, Mustafa Mond, says, and that's why you'll never write it. Because this world, he says, is not the same as Othello's world. And if it were like Othello, no one would be able to understand it, because they've so deadened emotions. They've so deadened the experience of being a human in this world, and covering all of these different feelings and parts of the human experience. Mustafa Mond says these people will never understand it. So he says this idea of happiness looks pretty squalid, is the word he uses, in comparison to misery. Misery is something that anybody can relate to, but true happiness is harder to relate to. So Mustafa Mond also says that misery really isn't necessary in order to maintain stability of the world. To make sure the society is stable, happiness is their choice for control. So John is really we're getting into some philosophical stuff, and we'll look at this much more closely in class, but John is really struggling with this philosophy that Mustafa Mond is presenting, because it is inherently contradictory to what John is thinking is actually necessary in this world. So, like I said, we'll do a little bit more close reading of this kind of philosophical argument that Mustafa Mond starts making. And so we see by the end of this kind of philosophical debate that Mustafa Mond and John are engaging in, Mustafa Mond says that really at the end of the day, the optimum population in this world is modeled on an iceberg, that there are 8/9 beneath the surface and 1/9 above. So because John starts asking about these Bakanoskified people that he's seen, and why do you need so many people? And Mustafa Mond says it's how we maintain our power. So what ends up happening is we get into all of this idea of what is lost, in the sense of for the sake of stability, and this very philosophical argument about what civilization really should entail, or what we need to experience a full life. John and Mustafa Mond have different opinions on that, for sure. So as Mustafa Mond sends for we find out that this controller has been almost given a choice, just like Bernard Marx and Helmholtz Watson, of trying to rebel and create an individuality and independence, or feeding into the system. And Mustafa Mond chose the system. Rather than being shipped off to some isolated, exiled island, he wanted to stay and have power. And so, using his power, he sends Helmholtz Watson and Bernard Marx off. He even asks Helmholtz, like, what do you think about the Falkland Islands? And Helmholtz is like, yep, that's where I'll go. Because Helmholtz is offered this choice. Do you stay in the world, in this society, or do you go elsewhere? And so that brings us to the end of chapter 16. I know this video was a little bit longer, but I was trying to get through a little bit more so that we could just get through 17 and 18 with one final video. We'll do some close reading in class and really get into the philosophy of the argument once we see these two cultures really clashing. So have a good weekend or whatever. Bye.